This is the Connected Baby podcast series, sponsored by you, the listener. If you'd like to help spread the message of the science of connection even further, then you can make a donation at connectedbaby.net/donate.
Welcome to the Connected Baby podcast, where we explore how people are putting the science of connection to use in their lives.
Hello there, this is a Connected Baby podcast with Dr. Suzanne Zeedyk and Gary Robinson. Suzanne, it's been just under a week since the atrocities took place in Paris, and subsequently, as you did with the last terrorism attack in France, you spoke about that, you blogged about it, and you've blogged about this atrocity. And it's for some people, it's going to be quite a challenging read. So we thought we'd take the opportunity to have a wee chat about your thoughts about what happened on that Friday and perhaps why. So first of all, what compelled you to blog about this this act?
Terrorism is terrifying for all of us, and we respond totally understandably with anger and fear and blame. What the science of attachment tells us, though, is the effect of trauma, especially early trauma, and how that leads to violence later on. And so whenever there are terrorist attacks, in the midst of all that awful, dreadful emotion, I find myself curious about what might have happened in the early lives of terrorists that would have traumatized them so much that it then leads to violence later on, especially if they are in a culture which endorses that violence. And so I write about that sometimes in order to try to help all of us to think about that. Of course, it's an unusual take because what most of us do is go immediately to a place of blame because it makes us feel better. I get that. It's quite a challenge to myself to choose to talk about terrorism with more curiosity. And of course, the risk I take is that some people will think that I'm condoning violence. So the challenge is, how do I think curiously about terrorism and violence without sounding like I'm condoning it?
And to be at that level of thought, I would imagine that you've got to take yourself far away from the actual facts of the event to almost look from the outside in at this, because I would imagine that somebody just in the general public, even like myself, won't be thinking in those terms about those people or their background, but will be thinking about those people that lost their lives subsequently in France.
Absolutely. And in fact, that's a more extreme version of what happens with all sorts of violence. So we have lots of people in prison in Britain that have committed violent acts. Terrorism, for me, is a much more extreme version of that same process. Well, most people in prison had trauma in their backgrounds as children. And so I'm trying to think about the process of trauma and how that warps your brain and your heart and your body and your sense of self and your sense of others early in life, and then the terrible consequences of that for us later on. If we can really get our heads around the impact of trauma and the importance of safety and joy and comfort as a child, as a baby, then we can think much more creatively about how to solve a whole range of problems, including terrorism. And that's not a voice that you hear in a lot of the debate that we have going on at the moment, but I think it's one that helps to think about how we create lasting solutions rather than intermediate solutions like let's inflict more violence because we're scared.
How do you defend the position that let's say somebody, a young person who's been brought up in a perfectly normal environment, has had good parenting, good schooling, good teaching. They've lived in, say, Great Britain for 18, 19 years, and suddenly they find themselves on the way to Syria to join the terrorist campaign, or indeed they find themselves on video beheading individuals. How do you square that circle if that person hasn't come from a particularly bad or traumatic background, or had a bad or traumatic childhood?
They're really important questions, and I don't have the answers to all of them. But here are some things that I know that the science tells us, and that living life as a human being tells us. People want to be part of something bigger than themselves. Most people want to be part of something else. And especially in adolescence, when your brain is undergoing lots of changes. Adolescence is a time of intensity and wanting to belong. So one element of answers that the science offers us is to think about what is happening in adolescence that so calls young men. Another insight is that although from the outside it can look like you've not had struggles in your childhood, you never actually know what's going on inside another person's life or another family's life. So children that we might think have, to use the words you just used, Gary, good parenting and good schooling, the experience of that may not be so good for them. There's now data that tell us that as many as perhaps 20% of nice, happy, apparently middle-class families have children with disorganized attachment patterns, and that's a quite shocking figure. So a disorganized attachment is when you have really experienced life as quite traumatic and quite scary, and that leads to really disorganized, often violent behavior later on. Right, that could be happening not due just to family events, but to the wider way in which all of us are living. So we spend more time outside of our family as babies now, right? So we spend time in childcare. We spend time in car seats which face backwards. We spend time in strollers that face forward. Okay, here's the risk I just took. People quite understandably will be saying, you're telling me that car seats lead to terrorism. You're telling me that has something to do with strollers. No, I'm not trying to make a direct link. What I am trying to do is to think about the ways in which we all live now and our babies live, and how that promotes connection or disconnection or fear or trauma or comfort or safety. And then link that to challenges that society has, including terrorism. And to really think in depth about that, because it becomes too easy just to say people are born evil, which I've heard a lot of this week. I am not saying that terrorist acts are not evil. I am trying to think about the motivation that is behind them, and how you have a whole society, a whole group of people who have lost touch with their humanity so much that they can go purposely trying to cause havoc and disruption and pain and terrible outcomes. I don't think that can be put down simply to cultural ideas and to extreme religions. That also has to have an impact on our physiology, and that thinking is the attachment process.
It's a tough conversation to have, because people will be listening to this and have lots of different questions. I've got questions coming out as we speak, but I could have been brought up in a stroller that was outward facing. I could have come from a background where my parents were divorced, a father who had troubles with alcohol and so on and so forth. But yet I haven't taken to terrorism. That's a very simple way of putting things. I think what I'm saying is, what is the additional thing inside somebody that makes them do this sort of unbelievable act, or going into a theatre and randomly shooting people? There has to be. Isn't there something unhinged about that?
Robert Grill, who is a psychotherapist, points to fundamentalist societies. And I have a lot of time for what Robin gets us to think about. He says that fundamentalist societies, such as radical Islam, he points out the trauma and terror that is meet upon children and women in those societies. And so that fundamentalist societies, including fundamentalist religions, and that's not just Islam, that can be Christianity, that can be Judaism, that can be Hindus, all fundamentalist religions and groups are founded on violence and control of often vulnerable in the society and patriarchy. And children who are raised on violence mete out violence. One of the images that came out in the last couple of weeks were pictures released by Daesh, and I choose that label rather than Islamic State as a way of trying to decrease the power that is currently being accredited to this group. So one of the images that was released this week by Daesh were pictures of jihadist schools for children. So there are children that are estimated to be about 6 who are unpacking Kalashnikov rifles, dressed in balaclavas, marching with guns. Those are children in the midst of cultural abuse. Those are children who are being warped. That's what they want. That's why it's useful to have children as part of your movement, because you can shape their brains and the way they see things. Those are children being abused. Those abused children will grow into violent people, or are likely to grow into violent people, and they will mete out violence further. So if we can just get our heads around that process, that's what I'm trying to speak to. I'm trying to think really seriously about the impacts of trauma early on and think that these people were once babies too. I am not condoning their actions. In fact, I'm trying to take seriously their actions so that we can think in our society more seriously about trauma. Because here's another link. In the last 5 years, funding to family support programs in Britain has decreased by 25%. Those are the years, your baby years are exactly the time when you need lots of family support. And so that raises a question, is that smart to remove that funding? It makes it sound like family support is a luxury that can go in times of austerity. I think it's dumb to remove support from families when we have all this evidence about trauma and not support families that, therefore, if you can't support your child, you're more likely to end up with a child whose trauma cannot be healed. And therefore, we put ourselves in jeopardy. Joan Smith wrote a piece in The Independent this week in which she highlighted the fact that 2 of the brothers, the Kouachi brothers, who committed terrorist acts in Paris in January, were children in care in the French system. And she says that they appear to have gone off the rail when their mother committed suicide. So, the French care system wasn't able to help those boys with their trauma, and the world is now paying for that. If you had a care system that could really help children to repair their wounds, their emotional wounds, then we would face less trauma like this. That seems to me really straightforward. It's in trying to get us to think seriously about that it is often unsettling for other people. And it's true. Your question said, but people can be traumatized and they don't always turn out like that. That's true. Aren't we lucky? Isn't that great that every single traumatized child doesn't turn to violence? What would be the state of our society if that were the case? But the fact that everybody doesn't turn to violence doesn't mean that trauma doesn't have some of the outcomes that we know it has. So we need to fight against it.
I understand that. And I think you make a very clear and compelling argument. How do we, you may not have the answer for this, I don't know who has, but how do we separate those youngsters that are vulnerable from the political and the religious propaganda that fuels that hatred? That's a really tough question as I ask that. But you've got young people who are traumatized, who might be on the cusp of doing something horrific, but yet they're exposed to religious and political bigotry, in their cultures.
Yes. Cultures always shape how we see the world and what seems appropriate and not appropriate. Do you know, if I go back to Robin Grill, who I just spoke about, he has a great book called Parenting for a Peaceful World. And in it, he goes through what he calls psychohistory, in which he tries to think about how different periods of time in history and different cultures at a time in history endorsed particular cultural behaviors. So the most striking one is the Nazis. Why was Adolf Hitler embraced by Germany of the time rather than treated as a nutter? Because Adolf Hitler had extreme views. I mean, look at the outcome of what he was able to convince a lot of people of. How did that happen? And what Robin Grill says is it has to do with the way in which children were raised in the generation before Nazism. That as a culture, Germany looked to a protective father. And therefore, Hitler was able to step into that cultural wish and wreak lots of violence. I think there's a message of hope in that. Look at what Germany is doing now. Right? That was German society just a few decades ago. And now Germany is leading in the welcome of refugees. And it's true, there are many far-right people in Germany, but something about the German culture has been able to heal itself from a time when it wrought terrible violence. I think that is to be celebrated, and actually that helps us to ask ourselves, how did that happen? How did Germany go from that place as a culture to a place in which you're welcoming refugees in such a short time period? Those are the kinds of questions that I think we need to be asking in order to fight terrorism and in order to think very strategically about what our response should be to terrorism. We need to find those messages of hope so that we can think out seriously attachment and culture in order to make the changes that will lead to the kind of outcomes we really want.
Without a doubt, you'll get a mixed response to your blog. Some will agree, some will disagree, some will fundamentally disagree. What do you say to those people who are fundamentally disagreeing and saying we should meet violence with violence?
All that does is move the violence to another place and to another generation. It just continues it. Part of the cause of the terrorism that we're in the midst of is the history of what has happened in the Middle East. I don't want to keep that up. What I'm trying to do is to think through, how do we stop violence? And some people will say you can't stop it. Well, do you know what? The Violence Reduction Unit, which started in Strathclyde Police, tackled that when they founded themselves 10 years ago. And people said, you can't fight violence. It just is, and we have to cope with it. And they have now, in 10 years, reduced gang violence by half in 10 years because they didn't believe that violence was inevitable. And as big as it seems to think, how are we really going to tackle Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism? If I think in little ways, in Glasgow, the Strathclyde Police were able to reduce violence by half in only 10 years. That's another message of hope. It's in believing that violence is inevitable that we get ourselves caught in a prison of thinking. And I'm trying to keep chinks in that, in the midst of fear, in the midst of terrible grief. So here's one way that I try to do that. I do not go to a place of blame. It's easy to go to a place of blame. Terrible, terrible things have been wrought in the last week. and not just in France, of course, in lots of other countries that we pay a little bit less attention to in Western society. So in Syria, in Lebanon, in Nigeria, in Iraq, I try not to go to a place of blame in order to make myself feel better. I am not condoning what has happened. What I am trying to do is to accept that that is the consequence of trauma. So I stay in a place of sadness and grief rather than protect myself through blame. That's quite a big ask. And I get that not everybody would want to do that, especially if you have lost people in the terrorist act. But you know what? There was a tribute by a father and husband 3 days ago in France whose wife was killed in the terrorist act. And lots of people may have seen that by now. And he has written a letter to the terrorists and said, "You will not get my hatred. My son will not get your hatred. I'm going now to pick up my son who's waking from his nap. We will go and play." And for me, that's the same message that I am trying to say. Playing and laughing and joy and connection is what will prevent us from future terrorists. The men who are terrorists now, and the few women, most of them will not have had someone playing and singing silly songs with them. And in our society, we can think that silly songs are a luxury. I'm trying to say they're not. It's essential to preventing future trauma. And therefore, we take ordinary moments of joy and connection and play and silliness and laughter much more seriously. We value them. We don't take them for granted.
This was a GRC production for Connected Baby.